Today, I'm going to share two stories about people who found themselves in truly just hopeless situations. And in both of these stories, the main character makes a very unexpected decision that completely changes their lives, for better or for worse. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please surprise the follow button with a brand new wireless controller for their gaming console. But don't tell them it's really just their old controller that you cut the wire off of. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Homesick. One night in late August of 1557, a Frenchman in his 30s named Martin Guerre was laying in a bed in a makeshift military hospital in St. Quentin, France, writhing around in pain. So a few weeks earlier, Martin had fought in this massive battle between the French and Spanish armies. And it had been this just horrible, bloody, violent battle. And during it, Martin had been wounded very severely. In fact, he had lost his leg. Now, this injury was obviously just devastating and very painful, but Martin also knew he was just lucky to be alive here. The doctors who had treated him at one point had seemed certain that he was going to die. So Martin and his doctors were all very surprised when he didn't die and he pulled through and survived. And Martin knew that a lot of his comrades who'd already left St. Quentin by this point and moved on with the army or gone back home, they very likely thought that he had died, given how bad it looked. But he was alive, and in a lot of pain. And really more than that, he was just sort of devastated. I mean, he was incredibly lonely. All of his army mates had basically left the hospital or just moved on with their careers or they'd gone home. And he was still here, unable to leave the hospital. And he has this injury too. He hasn't really gotten used to life without the use of his leg. And so his whole world has come crashing down. He's sort of by himself. All he has is the few army doctors who periodically come over and check on him, but beyond those people, he was just isolated and sort of trapped with these awful thoughts in his head 24/7. And eventually, these spiraling thoughts became really like the worst thing he was dealing with. They surpassed the actual physical pain he was dealing with. It was just this incredible depression that had set in. So Martin, he had grown up in this small rural village in southern France called Artigas. And he had gotten married at a very young age to a woman named Bertrande, and they had loved each other very much, and they had a son together. However, Martin had sort of completely messed up his life when he stole some grain from his father and had to literally flee town. Stealing, especially from a family member at the time, was not only criminal, but really quite shameful. And Martin had been so afraid of what people would say and what they would think of him that he decided not to face them at all. And he just left Artigas, leaving behind Bertrande and his son and his whole life. Now, initially, after he had sort of run away, he had considered going back and just saying he was sorry and accepting whatever punishment he'd be given. But he was always too scared to do it, and so he just didn't. And then before long, he got caught up in this war, and then years had passed by. It's like he's basically just gone. He's been removed from Bertrande and his son's life. He's just out of their lives. He's left them. And now, he's had his leg blown off. And in his mind, in this depressed state he was in, now, he had never really stopped thinking about his former life. He missed his wife terribly, but he's thinking to himself, I'm not the person she married. I'm a different person. I'm a degraded, bad person. She wouldn't even want to be with me at this point. And then beyond Bertrande and his son, and how they would look at him, he also was thinking that he was this thief, this shameful person that the rest of the village would not welcome back. So in his mind, he really felt not just isolated in this hospital, with no army mates nearby, stuck because of this injury, but he's also thinking, I don't even have a place in the world. I have nothing. My life is ruined. And so as Martin lay in the hospital bed, having these horrible thoughts and feeling all this physical pain in his leg, just having this horrible time, he found his mind wandering to somebody else in his life that had been very important to him, his friend Arnaud. He just wished if there was one person that he could talk to right now, it would be him. So Arnaud was a fellow soldier, and before this really horrible battle where Martin lost his leg, the two had been great friends and they bonded because they had a lot in common. They were both from small towns in the south of France, and they even looked the same, like they could pass as brothers. So they'd gotten really close and they talked about their lives and they shared a lot with one another. But like everyone else in the military that Martin had been friendly with or just worked with, Arnaud had, moved on. He was no longer here. He had gone somewhere else, wherever the army sent him. And so Arnaud was just yet another person in his life who he wished he could spend more time with, but knew he wouldn't. And so Martin's recovery would take a very long time. He was stuck in a hospital, basically bedridden with these horrible thoughts and this awful pain for weeks and then months, and then years passed by, and Martin still was just a shell of himself. And so he actually was moved to hospice care. However, after getting to hospice, Martin actually didn't die. Like typically hospice care is for people that are at the end of life, and that no longer is it about trying to save them, it's about keeping them comfortable until they pass away. But for Martin, he didn't die. He actually got better. And one afternoon in early September of 1560, so now about 3 years or so after he had lost his leg, Martin sat on a bench outside of the hospice that he had been staying in since the war had ended. Now, where he was located was actually just, a few miles from his hometown, Artigas. But despite the now close proximity to, his former life, if you will, to Martin, it felt like, Artigas could have been a million miles away. It couldn't have felt further away for him. So after Martin sort of miraculously healed inside of hospice care, and he was outfitted with a wooden prosthetic leg and was told that he could now leave and go about his life, well, it was good on the one hand. He got to go, back into reality, but he still had a lot of health problems as a result of his injuries. And, given this treacherous stretch of time where he had just been stuck in bed having these horrible thoughts, he had completely convinced himself that truly he was a shell of the man he used to be, and that nobody from his previous life would want him. Not his wife, not his son, not anybody. He was nothing now. And so even though Martin was better at this point, in his mind, he sort of had resigned himself to simply wasting away and dying all alone. He just figured, even though the doctors say I'm better, that's the path I'm on, and I'm not going to change it. But now, as Martin sat outside on this bench, he heard a voice. And when he looked over at the road in front of the hospice where he heard this voice, he saw there was a man that he had never met before who was clearly walking towards him, that was the person speaking to him. As the man approached Martin, he asked him, "Are you Martin Guerre?" And when Martin slowly nodded, saying, "Yes, I am," this man's face lit up, and he explained that he'd been looking all over for him. He said he'd been sent here on behalf of Martin's family back in Artigas, and he wanted to bring Martin back to them. When Martin heard this, he couldn't believe it. He really was so convinced that he was just destined for a life of shame and agony until he died. And now to hear that his family wants him back, they're looking for him, this was incredible. This was unbelievable. He really assumed he would never go home again. And now here was this guy saying, "Come with me, let's go home." However, before Martin could ask any follow-up questions, of which he had many, about his family and what they asked about him, that kind of thing, the man told Martin that actually he had been sent here to get Martin, and he was going to bring him home, but first, they needed to stop at the courthouse in a city called Toulouse. Martin looked at him like, "What do you mean?" And the man explained the reason behind it, and Martin simply couldn't believe what he was being told. A few days later, on the morning of September 12th, Martin climbed out of a wagon in front of the courthouse in Toulouse, a city about 40 miles away from Artigas. And Martin, he felt butterflies in his stomach as he, used his cane to climb the court steps to get up to the front doors. And then when he got up there, he took a deep breath, threw open the double doors, and stepped inside. And the instant he did, the first thing he saw is the entire courthouse was filled with people, and they all turned to look at him, and everyone's speaking with these hushed voices "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it." And that's when Martin realized he had just walked directly in to the middle of a trial. And so Martin, for a second, he just stood there staring back at all these people who were turned to look at him, and he realized that he recognized many of their faces. He saw some of his friends, he saw his uncle Pierre and some of his sisters. He saw his wife, Bertrande, as well as a boy sitting next to her, who must have been his son. And all of these people, they're looking at Martin with just looks of absolute shock on their faces. Like they were completely stunned to see him, and they're all looking at his wooden leg, and they're looking back at him. It was like they couldn't believe he had just walked in here. However, before Martin could really, fully appreciate the emotional moment he was having here, seeing his loved ones after over a decade, he first looked towards the front of the courthouse. And as soon as Martin saw what was up there, he knew that what that man had told him, who came up to him on the bench in front of the hospice, was true. And Martin had to bite his lip to keep from screaming. It would turn out Martin was wrong to believe that, his wife and the town of Artika would never accept him back, that he was worthless and should never return. Because his wife Bertrand and the town of Artika actually did welcome him back. Or so they thought. Because when Martin walked into that courthouse and looked towards the front of the room, what he saw was his long-lost buddy Arnaud from the war. And Arnaud was on trial. Arnaud did not just look like he could be Martin's brother. He looked exactly like Martin. And since Arnaud really had been very disliked in his own hometown for being a con artist, he wanted a fresh start in a new place after he left the army. So, years earlier, while Martin was lying in a makeshift army hospital so badly injured that doctors were telling him he was almost certainly going to die, while that was happening, his best bud, Arnaud, was using their likeness and his knowledge of Martin's life from all the times that Martin had confided in his friend to literally steal Martin's life. Arnaud had waltzed into Artika and told everyone there that he was Martin Guerre, and the entire town not only believed him, they celebrated his return. Arnaud was actually so convincing that even Bertrand had believed Arnaud was her husband, and she had gone on to have 2 additional children with him, believing this was Martin. However, one person, Martin's uncle, Pierre, he just didn't buy it. He thought this guy was a fake. He thought he was an imposter, and he took him to court for fraud. And that trial was why the man had tracked Martin down at the hospice and brought him to Toulouse to help prove to everyone there that, look, Arnaud's an imposter because here's the real Martin. And of course, it worked, because when Martin stepped into that courtroom and his own family laid eyes on him, the actual Martin Guerre, they realized right away that Arnaud truly was a fake. Arnaud was ultimately sentenced to death and hanged in front of Martin's house in Artigas while the entire village watched. As for Bertrand, Martin's wife, she was horrified to learn that she had not recognized her own husband and that she had had 2 kids with a stranger. She begged Martin to forgive her, but he never did. Our second and final story today is called Layers. One morning in November of 1940, an 84-year-old prospector named Erwin Robertson hiked down a snowy ridge in the Alaskan wilderness. He was pushing this sled that was full of supplies and animal furs, and it was pretty hard. As he was pushing this thing along, he was working so hard that he was breathing really heavy, and even though it was really cold outside, he could feel himself sweating underneath his clothes, like he was going to be covered in sweat. Now, Erwin knew that what he was doing was, risky. After all, he certainly was not as young as he used to be, and you don't want to get hurt out here or, totally exhaust yourself out here. This is the wild. But Erwin was not about to slow down because he could just not wait to get home. So Erwin had come to this area about 40 years earlier as part of the big Alaskan gold rush. And so, like basically every other prospector, he spent every summer and every fall at a cabin up in the mountains, predominantly hunting and mining. But his real home, where he really considered where he lived, was in the pioneer town of Eagle, Alaska, where he lived during the winter and the spring. And that is where Erwin was headed this morning. He had just wrapped up a very successful fall season up in the mountains, and he'd actually intended on staying in the cabin up in the mountains a bit longer. But a few days ago, the temperature had suddenly dropped, and Irwin did not have the supplies to wait out a winter storm up in that cabin. So he had packed up his things, told the handful of other prospectors in the area where he was going, and then he set out for Eagle. Now, this was a 100-mile trek to get to his home in Eagle, and it was through some very rough terrain, and also he's in Alaska, so this is like a very rough area to be navigating. But Irwin had made the trip at least once a year for the past 4 decades, so he knew what he was doing. So, despite really exerting himself here pushing the sled, he kept up as hard of a pace as he could manage for the next couple of hours, and then finally, around midday, he allowed himself to slow down and just take a quick break. However, after stopping and reaching into his parka and pulling out his canteen to take a sip of water, as he's sipping the canteen, something catches his attention out of the corner of his eye. And even though all he saw was just like a flash of movement out in the trees, he knew immediately what it was. So during this trek so far, there was this pack of wolves that was following him. He knew they were following him. But again, this is a man who lived in the wilds of Alaska, and so he was not unaccustomed to running into packs of wolves. He knew they were quite dangerous, especially for a guy who's alone in the woods right now. But he wasn't that concerned. However, he's thinking, okay, they're right over there. I'm going to take a very quick break. He, capped his canteen, put it back in his parka, and he's like, I'm going to keep on moving here. A few hours later, Irwin was a good ways further down the ridge, but he was starting to get cold. In fact, ice had formed on his beard and on his eyelashes. So the temperature had dropped much faster than he had expected, and he was starting to get worried because he knew it was only going to get much worse after the sun went down. And remember, he's been exerting himself this whole time. He's been sweating under his clothes, so he's wet under his clothes. And now the temperature's dropping, so he's like getting really, really cold. And so he decided that it was in his best interest to actually just stop right now and build a fire and just make sure he was warm. And so Irwin, he continued pushing his sled, keeping his eyes peeled for a good spot to actually stop and make camp. But as he's moving along, he hears something that causes him to just stop. It wasn't the sound of wolves. It was the sound of trickling water. And much like the wolves, water was quite dangerous out in the wilds of Alaska. But in many ways, water, especially in a very cold environment like this, was like the most lethal to people. Because getting fully wet in these temperatures basically guaranteed you would freeze to death. So Irwin moved very cautiously forward because, again, all he can do is hear the trickling water. He doesn't know where it is, and he's thinking, I better be careful I don't accidentally step into a creek or something and get wet here. He's already wet from sweating underneath his clothes. He can't afford to get more wet, and so he's moving carefully and cautiously. And then he rounds a bend and he actually sees the source of the sound. It was a creek that had basically completely frozen over, with the exception of a little bit of water that was sort of leaking out and sort of spilling out over the ice itself. And over time, this water that was making the sound and leaking out, it was sort of freezing in layers on the surface of this creek. And so it was kind of like this, moundy block of ice that was sitting on top of this creek, but you could clearly see water sort of trickling its way through it. And so when Irwin saw this, he realized that, as long as he was very careful to avoid stepping on the frozen creek itself, that this area would actually make a great spot to spend the night. He could refill his canteen from the little spout of water coming out of the creek. Plus, there were a bunch of dead trees nearby, which were perfect for firewood. And this was good news, because by this point, Irwin was so cold he was shivering. So he parked his sled and then began gathering up some firewood. But as he was going around doing this, he spotted a few of those wolves who had not stopped following him, not very far away from him. They were sort of lingering in the trees, clearly watching him. And for the first time, Irwin started to feel pretty anxious about these wolves. The fact that they were now even closer than the last time he saw them suggested that, one, they're still following him, but two, they're getting braver, they're getting closer. But Irwin's thinking, I can't just continue on here. As much as it makes sense to get away from the wolves, I'm beat physically and I'm soaked. My clothes are wet. I'm getting so cold. I'm going to die of hypothermia if I'm not careful. I got to start this fire. I have to make camp here. I just have to. About 20 minutes later, Irwin had gathered up all the wood that he would need, and he piled it all next to his sled, and then he got ready to start his fire. And in this kind of very cold environment, actually starting the fire, the process of igniting the fire, was a potentially very dangerous process. because in order to light the match, to light the fire, Erwin would have to take off his mittens and expose his hands to the freezing cold. But Erwin had to do it, so he reached down and he bit one of his mittens and pulled it off with his teeth, and then with that hand he reached into his parka and he pulled out his fire kit, which contained these thin scraps of tinder that he would use as fire-starting material. Then he grabbed a match and he struck it to light it, but it didn't catch, like the head of the match did not catch on fire. And so Erwin tried again, striking the match once more, but it didn't light. And again, he just kept trying over and over, and eventually he just snapped the match in half. Now, Erwin didn't panic because he knew that, in extreme cold, some matches light better than others, and some don't even light at all. And he had seen this happen before, so he wasn't panicking. Instead, he pulled off his other mitten to make sure he had max dexterity here, and he took out the other match and he held the thing he was striking it against, and he struck the second match, thinking this one will light. But it didn't, and he tried again and again, and he's starting to get a little panicked when finally he strikes the match, and this one does catch. But by this point, he's now had his naked hands exposed to the unbelievably cold temperatures for over a minute, and his hands were starting to seize up from the cold. They were shaking, in fact, so badly from the cold that even though he's got this light, his hands shook so much that by the time he transferred it to the tinder, the shaking caused it to extinguish. It was out. And at this point, Erwin did start to panic because his hands are in so much pain and they're so stiff from the cold that he was afraid that even if he put his mittens back on his hands, they wouldn't warm up fast enough for him to then remove his mitten and try this whole fire thing again. He really needed the fire in order to warm his hands, but obviously he needs his hands to make the fire. And so he's got a problem here. So Erwin, who was not one to give up easily, he just gritted his teeth, and with his, failing hands, he just reached down and, fumbled and grabbed a third match, thinking, I gotta light this one. I gotta start this fire to warm my hands up, to warm my whole body up. I gotta do this. And so he's got this third match. He's barely able to hold it. And it took all his focus just not to drop it. But finally, he managed to scrape it against the side of this matchbook. And to his relief, it did catch. And so immediately, Erwin, very carefully, kind of sheltered this little flame, and he carried it over to the tinder, and he put the flame on the tinder, but nothing happened. Erwin waited for the bundle to catch fire, but it didn't. And then the match, just burned out. And for a long moment, Erwin just stared at this scene in front of him in confusion. He didn't understand because he knew that this time he had done it all right. He had lit the match, he put it on the tinder. He had done this so many times before, but it's just not working. But then he looked more closely at the tinder, and his heart just sank because he knew that the situation he was in was truly catastrophic. Several days later, there were some people living in Eagle, Alaska, who noticed that Erwin was not in Eagle. He had not arrived. And it didn't make any sense because he had told people when he would be there, and there was no reason he would be late unless something happened. And so these folks were just concerned enough that they went to authorities, and by November 19th, which is almost exactly a week after Erwin had struggled to light that fire, the U.S. Marshal's Office was out in force looking for Erwin. And so on November 19th, a deputy from the U.S. Marshal's Office who was out in the wilderness, a part of the search, he and his team came through these trees and he saw this clearing up ahead, and he noticed there was something in the middle of it. It was a sled that was surrounded by supplies, and it was set up on the bank of a frozen creek. And so immediately the deputy thought, this could be Erwin's sled. He could be nearby. And so he and his men, they rush down to this sled and they look around and they see there's a rifle propped up against a tree, and there's this stack of unused firewood, and there's all this tinder and a bunch of matches that are strewn about on the ground that also don't appear to have been used. But beyond these supplies and these things they're seeing, there was nothing else. Erwin was not here. However, the longer the deputy stood there just looking around, the more he realized what actually must have happened to Erwin. Because after sort of doing an initial scan, he realized there was something else in this clearing that he hadn't noticed at first. Wolf tracks. The deputy told his men that, very likely Erwin has been killed and carried off by wolves here. So follow these tracks and see if we can recover Erwin's body. And And so the search party set out to go look. However, pretty quickly, they realized that, as they're following these tracks, that something just seemed off here. It seemed obvious given that Irwin had not shown up yet. He's been found, his stuff's all here, he's not here, and there's these tracks here. It seemed obvious that he must have been killed by wolves, but they don't see any blood anywhere. Like, wouldn't he have been attacked by his stuff? And there'd be signs of an attack, and then he's been dragged off. There should be a trail of blood or something. Any indication that a struggle happened, but no, it was just tracks, nothing else. And so eventually, as the deputy and his men are just following these tracks sort of farther and farther away from the sled and what they had found near the creek, they stopped and they're like, hold on a minute, something doesn't add up here. Let's go back and take another look at the actual site where the sled was, because again, there's no evidence of an actual wolf attack. There's just evidence of wolves. And so they turn around and they follow the wolf tracks back to where the sled is, and they start looking around more closely for, maybe there is some sign of a wolf attack that they missed, and they're looking around, and they eventually spot what appear to be Irwin's tracks. And they began following these, thinking that, maybe Irwin had become hypothermic and confused and wandered off into the woods, and either he died out there or had been attacked out there by wolves, but let's follow these, and this is bound to lead us to wherever Irwin went. But the footprints, they only led away from the sled a few feet before doubling back and stopping right at the edge of this frozen creek. And so for a minute, the deputy's looking down, trying to make sense of how these tracks just stop right here. Did they miss something? Where did Irwin go? But then the deputy just literally looked at the creek, towards the center of this frozen creek, which to that point he hadn't really been focusing on. It was all the things on the land. Now he's looking at the creek itself, and suddenly he knew what happened to Irwin. So a week earlier, on the night that Irwin is trying to start this fire, he's desperate, he's becoming hypothermic, the wolves are nearby, he finally strikes that third match, he gets it to light, but the tinder won't light, because the tinder was wet. We can assume the reason it was wet is because he kept his fire kit inside of his parka, and he was working so hard with that sled, he was sweating so much that he sweat on the tinder, and he soaked it. And so now he does not have a way to start a fire. He cannot make fire. Without fire, he is going to freeze to death. There's no two ways about it. He is a veteran of the Alaskan wilderness. He knows he's doomed. And worse than that is he knows the wolves are getting closer and closer. And so no longer was it about oh, what do I have to do to survive this thing? No, it became, how do I want to die? And as he listened to the wolves howl not too far away, he thought to himself, I certainly don't want to die by being eaten alive. And so he made a choice. A week later, the deputy from the U.S. Marshal's office was standing by the creek trying to figure out what happened to Irwin, and he looks out and he realizes there is a lump in the middle of the ice, right in the center of the creek, that he had not recognized at first as anything significant, but now he was looking more closely, and he realized it was Irwin. In an effort to avoid being eaten by wolves, Irwin had at some point walked into the middle of the creek, laid down on his back right in that break in the creek where that little bit of water was trickling out, that he had filled up his canteen right there, and he had just laid there, and the water kept spilling out onto him and gradually froze in layers over his whole body, essentially freezing himself into this cocoon in the creek. And so eventually he had frozen to death inside of the creek, but the ice had kept the wolves away. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locascio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and Andrew Kelleher. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locascio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. today's stories are about how sometimes doing what you think is the right thing can actually be the most dangerous choice you can make. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're walking into a building and the follow button is right behind you, obviously following you into the building as well, make sure the second you go in, you turn around, make eye contact, and then you pull the door shut. Don't hold the door for them. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Tangled and Frozen. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, 18-year-old Michael Peary was 1,000 feet underground, crouched inside of a dark cave in Lafayette, Georgia, along with 4 of his friends. As Michael looked around, his headlamp beam bounced off all the low-hanging rocks and underground waterfalls and deep crevices, and it all just kind of felt like some kind of dark and otherworldly planet down here. So this cave that they were in was a famous cave called Ellison, and Michael and his friends had driven over 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville to see it. Ellison was almost 12 miles of tunnels and shafts and crevices, and thousands of cavers went through it every year. It was very popular. Now, to be clear, caving as an activity was not really Michael's thing. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida, and he mostly considered himself to be a pretty quiet person and liked studying or playing in his school band or volunteering with his church youth group. And so crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, very claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet underground was not really his first choice for fun. But Michael was not there today for fun. He was there because his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach, had suggested it. So he had said, okay, I'll go with you. Just now, Michael looked over to where Grant was sitting with his girlfriend, whose name was Carrie, and also they were sitting with 2 of their other friends. And the group of them were all looking through a backpack and sort of taking stock of the various pieces of gear that they had brought along with them. Now, they'd only entered Ellison just a few minutes ago, but already the group had stopped because there was something in this area that Grant really wanted to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it usually happened. Hence why Michael capitulated and wound up in this cave, because Grant wanted him to. And so, like normal, he went along with it. So Grant, he was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also members of. And when Michael had joined the fellowship, Grant had sort of taken him under his wing and told Michael that he had tons of potential. In fact, he said Michael had enough potential to be the next president of the fellowship. And this had given Michael a ton of confidence because he really looked up to Grant. I mean, a lot of people did. Grant was just cool. He was a few years older than Michael and was basically like a 6-foot-tall ball of positive energy who was always looking for some adventure to go off and do. Grant had been exploring caves as a hobby for the last 3 years, and he was actually really the only member of their group with any real caving experience. And it was actually this lack of experience amongst the other people that were with Grant, including Michael, that was the reason they were going through an easier tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain and did not require much gear like rope or climbing equipment. It was like very beginner. But despite that, despite the low level of difficulty of the caving route they had chosen, they'd brought that stuff anyway, all that extra equipment, because along this easier route at the place where they were now stopped was the entrance to a vertical shaft that Grant specifically wanted to climb down, even if he went alone. This shaft was 125 feet deep. So think of like a 10-story building. That is how deep this pit went. But it was actually called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, deep pits in Ellison, it was nothing. Some were way deeper, like over 500 feet. So this was definitely not beginner. This was an advanced thing to be doing, so Grant was going to do it. But again, it's sort of a novice level, more advanced thing to be doing in this cave. Now, Michael watched Grant take the backpack with all the equipment in it over to this pit's entrance, which was basically just a very large hole in the ground that was over near this waterfall, and it was only about a few feet away from Michael. And so Michael walked over to Grant to help set him up, which involved attaching a climbing rope to the rocks that Grant could then use to lower himself into this pit with. This process is called rigging, And it took them a while, since really Michael had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every step, because Michael, again, is not an experienced caver at all. But as Michael worked with Grant to get him all rigged up, he found himself peering into the pitch black hole, and as he looked down into what just felt like this bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach kind of flip. He was glad he had not promised Grant that he would go into the pit too, because, seeing it now up close in person, this was terrifying. He did not want to go into this thing. But Grant clearly did. He was excited. And so Michael and Grant continued to get Grant all set up, and then eventually, finally, when Grant was rigged, Michael heard the sound of something pretty heavy sliding off of a rock, and then moments later there was this loud, echoing thud from deep inside of this hole, the warm-up pit. For a moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what the sound was. Maybe it was a rock falling into the pit. But he looked over at Grant, and Grant had a very unhappy expression, and he was looking at the ground right next to the pit hole, and that was where their backpack had been, with all the equipment inside of it, at least the equipment that they weren't using, and the backpack was not there anymore. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet down into this pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. They did not want their backpack in this hole, but it was actually worse than just losing their equipment potentially, because in that bag was their only cell phone that they had brought with them. And it was also where they had put all their ropes and other climbing gear. They'd taken some stuff out, to get Grant rigged up here, but still, losing this bag felt really bad. Without its contents, they could easily get stranded or trapped inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anybody. They'd be stuck. And so Michael could actually feel himself starting to panic, but then Grant cut in and played it cool as always, and he said, look, it's no big deal. He would just go down there and he would get it. He was going into the hole anyway, and he was rigged up after all, so he would just go down and retrieve the bag. It would be fine. And then before Michael or, Grant's girlfriend or the other friends could say anything, Grant just, strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders, which were climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled way, and he began sort of positioning himself to go down into this pit. And Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident that he was able to basically make everybody else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt himself calming down just watching Grant. And this was not the only time that Grant had projected calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year, he'd casually climbed up the exterior of one of their school's dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did do it. And he also had joined the school's ROTC, which is a military reserve training program, and learned how to jump out of planes. So he had skydived, sort of a thrill-seeking activity. And so this moment in the cave seemed like yet another example of why Grant was really such an incredible leader. And Michael found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, that he could be just as fearless as Grant. But for now, Michael watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole and then disappeared into the abyss below. And for the next few minutes, it was very quiet, and all Michael could hear was the sound of the waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just sort of talked amongst themselves and waited for Grant to call back up that he was down there and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant, and he did call out from somewhere down in the hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying because the waterfall that was kind of blasting nearby was really loud, and also Grant's voice echoed around the cave, which made it hard to tell what he was saying. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others were not worried. They figured that this was just an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of this pit and kind of leaned over and just looked down. But, he couldn't see Grant. He was too far down and it was too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself because they couldn't understand what he was saying. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael, but Michael still couldn't really make out what he was saying. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he doesn't know what Grant's saying, one thing was definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something really, really quickly, very urgently. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what it was, the tone was very clear. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems arise when you are rappelling into a 125-foot hole underground in this cave. That, problems can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they sort of realized that something was wrong for Grant, it was really shocking. Grant is the guy that got other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing rattled him. And so just to hear him basically panicking, it was really unsettling for those at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden realization that, one, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way, but worse, two, is they're not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they lacked experience, but also all the caving, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that fell into the pit that's down there with Grant. So there's no way they can realistically help him if he is in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one cell phone is down in that backpack in the pit. And so unless Grant can figure out whatever problem he's got and get back up here on his own, Michael and the others, without even saying it, knew like they were kind of helpless. And so as this realization is setting in for Michael and the others, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds sort of panicked, to straight up screaming. He's screaming for them. Something is horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying to get him to clarify what's going on, but you have this waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing everywhere. It's dark, and Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them, and so it's chaos, it's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends, and they say, look, we're going to stay here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two leave the cave, go get help. And so the other two, they rushed off to do just that, while Michael and Carrie just sat there listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere down in this hole. They still have no idea what's wrong, but clearly there is an emergency here. And so for a little while after the friends have gone off, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really talking to Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming, they can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole that everything's going to be okay. We've sent to get help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They have no idea if he can hear them or understand them. They're assuming that the acoustics are bad down there too. Again, the sound of that waterfall is so loud. It's so dark. And so they're just like having this awful moment. But then what cut through all this chaos was at some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. Like he was directly yelling to Michael, like, I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously the situation has escalated dramatically and already, like, things are bad. And for Michael, this felt like a big deal. Before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously bad. But Michael, he kind of views himself as, Grant's successor, potentially. He's going to be the next, president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was like this fearless leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his name called out, that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him, like, you, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait. Something needs to be done, and I need to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up, and he grabbed the extra harness they still had, and he put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening, and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. Or what are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over and he attached his harness to the same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason, and into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared into this hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit, she put her hands together, and she prayed as hard as she could for Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying, which was basically that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie, and as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her body, because now she's thinking everything's okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it. She was so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt, and the cave was very damp, and there's this waterfall kind of spraying water everywhere. It was cold. It was a damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness. What's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine, but didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell clearly there's something really wrong down there, and it probably has to do with Grant. And so she stood up, she began pacing back and forth, her stomach's in knots, and she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just say that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, yell out, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. But it began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more what's going on, until finally Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around, yelling out to Michael and Grant, but the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 p.m., a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into the Ellison cave with a bag of climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them that had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving slowly because it took time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there were a lot of people and a lot of equipment, specialized equipment that was required, and also usually the victims were trapped in, pretty remote and difficult to access places, like tunnels and shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his team were the initial smaller group that went ahead of the larger one to just kind of get the rescue started. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman who was sitting by a large hole, and she was shaking and terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole, and that Grant had gone in, there had been some issue, Michael had gone in after him, and now, when she called out for them, neither of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her out of the cave, and then once they had left, Anmar put on his climbing gear, and as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into this pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft, and at first he can't see anything, but after a little while, he began to see somewhere down below were what appeared to be 2 lights towards the bottom of this pit, which he assumed belonged to the 2 men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness right below him. It would turn out, when Grant rappelled down into this warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rig to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the water, like the water is coming off this waterfall, it's hitting him, he got stuck. His rope got tangled. And where he got stuck was literally in the path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave, he can't go up, he can't go down, and he's just getting pounded by freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around to try to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this shaft, there's nowhere to go, and he's just dangling there, and he began trying to scream out for help, but that was why his words were muffled, because the water was hitting him in the face, so he couldn't speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have actually sent his body into shock. And it's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or think anymore. I mean, he was becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. And he said it really clearly, kind of managed to get his face out of the water for a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his calling. He needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so into the hole he went, and he hooked his rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had, and down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached where Grant was, but got stuck as well. Also in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was, like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie. but he also got tangled at the same spot, couldn't move, his body's getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two men had froze to death. They basically dangled inside of this hole, getting hit by this water for about 2 hours before their bodies just shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his life to save Grant's. Our next story is called Not Going Anywhere. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his Washington State Lodge with a whiskey and Coke and turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. And just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume of the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore because a couple of his cats in the other room were fighting and yowling and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had, but it was a lot, maybe a dozen. And even though at this moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him because he liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's wife, Edna, had died. And since then, he had lived alone, minus all these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors either, so for the most part, he had been fairly isolated the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the lake that his lodge was on, was 4 hours south of the major city of Seattle and pretty far into the wilderness. The lake did get busy in the summer with tourists, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there, and they were very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and lake, and he had his whiskey and Cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lives way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not expect visitors, but in this case, he knew who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really had only one problem, and it was a major problem, at least to him, and that was the government. And for the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door, had been harassing him, trying to get him to leave his lodge in the wilderness that he loves so much because they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation and they wanted everybody to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country, and he'd even fought for it during the First World War, but he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law and made his own booze, like he just didn't care. So, over these last few days that these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated, he had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, certainly, not with local police, not with his own family, not with his friends, or not with the two ex-wives he'd been with before finding Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were, and not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy that Harry did know, clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door when the deputy clearly had announced themselves, knowing Harry would know who they were, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him you gotta leave, the deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad, because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years, and 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little after she had died, so truthfully it was kind of falling apart and it smelled terrible, because of all the cats, but it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this area, was his religion, and he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside was a very firm "good night," which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself and picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground, and at the same time sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house, with his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a glass of whiskey in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreens, but it also had a great view of the mountains and also the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert because the woods were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and left when told to, which meant Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, officials had not physically attempted to force him out, but now that Harry saw them assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities, and that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's refusal to leave his wilderness home just because the government told him to had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on and they'd started coming to his house. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to stay in his home. Because the way he saw it was the government could really not make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful, which was sort of admirable, although people didn't really understand it, but it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house.
No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right, this is my home. It's going to have to come and get me. And no authority can take me out of here. No authority dare.
And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he'd bottled and distilled during his Prohibition days, which he called Panther Pea, and about his relationship with his late wife and how they used to dance together at the edge of the lake, or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this is 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail and Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been happy with his quiet life, no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it's like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. And the sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 a.m. that morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights. They were trying to save him. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loves so much. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Both of our stories today are about people who are just looking for a solution to their problems. However, the solutions they settle on and ultimately use wind up being the worst thing that ever happened to them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next freezing cold day, go ahead and spray down the Follow Button's driveway with water, turning it into a skating rink. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Locked In. On March 15th, 2011, just after 1 p.m., 16-year-old Marcus Freeman sat behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck, belting out the lyrics to one of his favorite songs on the radio as he and his girlfriend Carly drove down a highway in Northport, Florida. The pair had just left the dentist, where Marcus had just gotten some dental work done, and in fact his jaw was pretty sore. But he was basically singing right now, as was Carly, in order to distract himself from the pain. And for the most part, this worked, but every time a song ended, it's like all he could think about was just how sore his jaw was. But Marcus was not like your typical 16-year-old kid. You know, he was sort of accustomed to having discomfort in his life, both physical discomfort and mental discomfort. And he really worked hard to be someone who was able to push through discomfort, including things like jaw pain. So he was the quarterback of his varsity football team at his high school, Northport High. And over the last year, he'd really begun to focus on his physical fitness. And so he'd begun doing these really difficult physical workouts that were sort of like, vomit inducing. And then also, Marcus, he was for the most part pretty mentally well adjusted. But, nerves were definitely a thing. He's the quarterback of the varsity high school team. He's only 16 years old. And so, nerves before games and just generally some level of anxiety sort of existed in his life. And so he would, work with a counselor at his school to try to overcome those nerves and try to manage those feelings when he was about to perform. So a different type of pain, but nonetheless, it's like this was a kid who was very forward-leaning when it came to sort of dealing with pain and discomfort and managing it. And all this hard work that Marcus was doing to sort of become the strongest version of himself he could be appeared to be paying off because, for example, the football team that he was the quarterback of, historically for years, they had been sort of terrible. But now, under Marcus's leadership and, him being the quarterback, they were now coming off one of their best seasons ever. And actually, it was not even just Marcus and the football team that appeared to be on the upswing these days. The whole school was. Northport High used to have terrible sports sort of across the board, and also low graduation rates and bad test scores. Like, this was not a high-performing school. But now, it had totally turned a corner. Most of the sports programs beyond football were all improving. Grades and test scores across the board were all improving, and also just students at this school just seemed happier and more well-adjusted. It was not just Marcus, it was like everybody. But there was a reason for this, and basically everybody who went to Northport knew what that reason was. There was one person to thank for this really positive change. Principal George Kenny. He'd been Northport's principal for a decade now, but in the last few years, he'd made some tweaks to the curriculum and put a ton more focus on individual student support. And the result of all of this appeared to be, Marcus and all of his classmates thriving. But right now, the pain in Marcus's jaw was really all he could think about. And it seemed to be getting more severe, and it was starting to actually make him feel sort of dizzy. But Marcus had been, working on pain management, and he sort of had some tactics and techniques that he would use when, pain got sort of overwhelming, whether it was physical pain in this case or mental anguish or whatever it was. Like, he was going to employ the tactics and techniques that he had been working on. And so Marcus, as he's driving and, Carly's singing next to him, he took a deep breath and tried to relax and just breathe and just think of anything else besides the pain. Just put his mind somewhere else. This was actually literally what he did, during football games when he'd be super exhausted and beat up, but, he's the leader of the team. He's the quarterback. Like, he has to find a way to push through that pain and keep going. And this is what he would do. He would do this mental exercise where he basically sort of let his mind drift away from the physical uncomfortability he was experiencing and just focus on other things. And it was sort of like meditative, and it generally worked. But this time, it just didn't appear to be working. His jaw pain, kept on throbbing, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. And then soon it sort of felt like the pain was growing, like it was radiating up his cheek into his whole head, and it was like really becoming overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept, trying to allow his mind to sort of separate from the pain. And all of a sudden, that throbbing pain in his jaw stopped. And Marcus relaxed because truly the pain was now gone. At the same time Marcus was sort of going through this mental exercise, in the passenger seat, Carly was fiddling with the radio, trying to find another good song to sing along to. Carly loved being with Marcus. So much so that she'd just gone to the dentist with him just so they could spend more time together. She felt like Marcus was super kind and he was funny, and when she was with him, they could just talk and laugh for hours, and it would just feel like a second. Except now, as Carly was still fiddling with the radio, she realized that Marcus was acting unusual. He was being really quiet. And actually, when she looked over at him and stared at him, she sort of gasped, because Marcus appeared to have gone almost like completely rigid. His arms were sort of stuck out in front of him, like gripping the steering wheel, but in this weird stiff way. And his hands, they were turning white from gripping the steering wheel as tightly as he could. And then also his head was sort of tilted back, and his eyes actually were beginning to roll back into his head. And so when Carly saw that like literally his eyes were being taken off the road, she began screaming his name and snapping and clapping and being like, "Hey, what are you doing?" But Marcus didn't answer. He didn't even react. He just continued blazing along at nearly 100 miles an hour in this weird, like, rigid state. And so Carly, she really began to panic. She's screaming, she's grabbing Marcus, she's trying to like get him out of this trance he's in, but he just wouldn't move. He wouldn't look at her. It was like he was gone. And then Carly turned and looked out the windshield and she screamed as the truck veered off the road and careened into a tree. And for Carly, as soon as that happened, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly opened her eyes, and her whole body ached and her head pounded, and at first she really had no idea where she was. But then she heard beeping sounds which were coming from these machines near her, and she looked around and saw the room she was in was very white, and she realized she was definitely in a hospital. And once she realized that, it was like the whole terrible ordeal came rushing back to her. She remembered Marcus and how strange he had looked, rigid at the wheel, and then she remembered crashing and hitting that tree. And so as she's processing this horrible thing, a nurse came into the room, and Carly immediately asked them, where is Marcus and when could she talk to Marcus? But that's when she found out from the nurse that Marcus was dead. Almost a month later, on April 8th, Carly was now out of the hospital, sitting in her Spanish class at Northport High School. And she was trying her best to pay attention to what the teacher was saying, but concentration was not something that came easily to Carly these days. Physically, she had healed from the accident, but emotionally, she had not. Marcus's death had truly devastated her, but perhaps the worst part of his death was there was just no good explanation for it. Why was he acting the way he was acting before they crashed? What happened to him? What was going on? And truly, at this point, it was still just a huge mystery to basically everyone. Now, the media had come out and said that what happened was Marcus simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly was right there with Marcus, and that did not seem like what happened. Again, Marcus, went into this trance of sorts, and it was him being sort of locked in that position that ultimately caused the car to, at 100 miles an hour, veer off the road and crash. But there was no weather, there were no obstacles in the road. It was whatever caused Marcus to freeze up is what caused the crash, but it was nobody was talking about it or nobody understood it. Now, there were some theories about maybe what could have caused Marcus to act that way, in particular at the high school, at Northport High. People believed that, maybe Marcus, when he was at the dentist, had gotten some kind of sedation that maybe he had had a bad reaction to, like a late onset bad reaction while they were driving home, and that caused him to stiffen up. Or maybe he had just had a random medical event that caused him to act that way. However, when his autopsy came out, it showed there had been no trace of drugs or any indication that Marcus had had anything like a seizure or a stroke or an aneurysm. So those theories were sort of pushed aside. But, this tragedy was considered an accident, not any sort of foul play. And so the police were not investigating further. They basically were there on site, they saw what happened, they documented it, but there was not a deeper investigation happening here. So for Carly, she knew that it was very possible that she and everyone else would really never get the answers that they were looking for here, that it would just be a mystery what happened to Marcus. So for Carly, it just was really difficult to sort of just go back to normal life, go back to school and just be a kid again when there was this huge hole in her life that just felt like it was never going to be filled. But Carly was not the only one grieving here. Marcus had been incredibly popular at Northport High. And after their principal, Mr. Kenny, had notified the student body about his death, There had been a whirlwind of memorial services and student gatherings, and Mr. Kenny had made sure that counselors were brought into school to help kids process what had happened. And so now, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class, trying her best to concentrate, she suddenly heard the crackle of the school's announcement system kick on. And then she heard Mr. Kenny's voice, and he said he had something to tell them. And Carly could tell pretty much right away that whatever he was going to tell them was not going to be good news. Now, normally, Mr. Kenny was a very enthusiastic and very sort of positive person, but right now, his voice was very solemn, and there was a slight tremor to it as he began to speak. And then at some point, he kind of stopped himself, and he cleared his throat, and then he just said, "Another Northport student has just died." In the weeks following that announcement, Carly tried to wrap her head around how it was possible that 2 students had died at their school in 2 months. Now, the second death was not similar to Marcus's death in terms of how they died. The second death was self-inflicted. But still, Northport, which was a small, tight-knit school, was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. Like, this didn't happen. But then, just weeks later in early May, Carly's confusion turned into outright disbelief when another Northport student died, also self-inflicted. And this really sent Carly and the rest of the already very fragile student body at Northport into a state of shock. I mean, 2 students dying so close together was already so difficult to process, but 3 was unthinkable. And so now it was like the entire student body was on edge, like almost bracing for more awful news, like more deaths. It just almost felt inevitable. However, one night soon after the 3rd death, Carly was at her home in her room on her computer, scrolling around on Facebook, when she saw a post from another classmate. And when she read what this person had written, which was very short, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of this sooner. This person's post pointed out that all 3 of these deaths had one thing in common. So many students and staff and parents at Northport High believed that the school's overall recent improvements in athletics and testing and general student satisfaction were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. Mr. Kenny was very student-focused, and he offered the kids at Northport a lot of individual attention. But he also had a secret. So over the last 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been meeting with students and staff members to resolve various personal issues like people's anxiety or pain management or mental health issues, test scores, being better at concentrating. Like, he was there and working with people to try to sort of make them the best version of themselves. To do this, he put the students and the staff members under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite sometimes as many as 2 students a day into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions, and he would do the same thing for teachers. He even sometimes brought entire school sports teams into his office, and he would hypnotize them before games to improve performance. But, critically, Mr. Kenny not only performed the hypnotism himself, he also taught the students how to do it on themselves. Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a brief course in hypnosis, and certainly did not have a license to be, using it to diagnose or resolve actual mental health issues or even physical issues. Like, he was not licensed to be doing this. But a lot of kids really responded to his sessions and reported improvements in their anxiety and their focus, and some athletes started excelling in their sports. But along with these good developments, there were some alarming side effects. Some Northport parents reported that their children began experiencing these strange personality changes, and they would have these blank stares on their faces after they had begun hypnosis with Mr. Kenny. Others said that after these sessions, their child became disoriented or started doing things they wouldn't normally do, or began thinking about hurting themselves. And so after the 3rd student death, that Facebook post that Carly found had revealed that all 3 of those students had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore he was not the one responsible for these deaths, but he was charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he did receive a year of probation. In addition, the Sarasota County School Board paid a total of $600,000 to the 3 victims' families, and as for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. Our second and final story today is called The Approach. Shortly after 8 p.m. on October 9th, 1996, 31-year-old Anthony Irvin walked down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, towards a local grocery store. It was not that cold outside, but, it was kind of windy and it was dark, and, Anthony, he only had a light jacket on, and so he wasn't feeling that comfortable, and so he pulled his jacket tight around him as he walked, and as he was walking, all he wanted to do was just go home where it was warm. But he couldn't. He really needed money first. Once he had money, then he could go home. So Anthony had a pretty tough life, and for the most part, he really was just a career criminal. He had not had a regular job in a very long time, and instead, when he needed money, like tonight, he would steal from local businesses or he would mug people. In the past 9 years, he'd been arrested 8 times for things like robbery and assault. And so, for the most part, he was just a huge nuisance to the people in this neighborhood. Even if they felt bad for him, he was just a problem. But, despite how often he committed crimes, his crimes were always relatively petty. And so he really didn't serve much time at all in prison. He always ended up back out on the street, and he always ended up continuing to, be a problem. But tonight, though, as Anthony walked down the road, he was not thinking about how his behavior impacted his neighbors. He was thinking about finding some place or someone to rob. And tonight in particular, he thought, I'm going to look for a person. I need a target. And so he's walking down the road, and he actually began to get kind of worried because it seemed like it was quieter than usual out on the street. Like there was nobody out here. And he started to worry that if he didn't find somebody soon, like he was going to be out of luck, no money. But just then, right up ahead, a young man turned the corner and began walking up the sidewalk in Anthony's direction. He was sort of a smaller, younger-looking guy. He appeared to be all alone, and right away, Anthony's like, oh my goodness, perfect. I have my mark. I'm going to rob this guy. And so Anthony, he begins walking towards, this unsuspecting young man. And as he got closer, Anthony realized he knew who this guy was. This was Harry, his neighbor. And he's like, oh my gosh, perfect. Because I know Harry is super soft-spoken and gentle, like he's so calm. He's not going to do anything. Like, he's going to be so easy to rob. Yeah, it's horrible to rob your neighbor. He's going to know I did it, but what's he going to do? So Anthony marches right up to Harry, and he stops right in front of him, blocking his path. And then Anthony delivers, his classic mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly drove his cruiser fast down a city street. He'd been called to the area about a mugging, and he was hopeful he would get there in time to potentially catch the mugger, or at least see who they were or see where they went so that maybe he could catch them. And so Kelly, he turns the corner and he pulls up in front of the address where he's been told to go. And as he's pulling up, he sees there are 2 men out on the sidewalk. One is lying motionless on the ground, and the other is sitting on top of him, and Kelly's thinking, perfect, I have caught the mugger. Like, he's the one on top of the other. I've caught him in the act. Great, I'm going to jump out of the car and arrest this guy. But no. When Kelly got out of the car and learned what actually happened here, this became easily the strangest thing he had ever come across in his 25-year career. So when Anthony mugged people, what he would do is he would put his hand into his coat pocket and he would press his fingers forward like he had a gun in his pocket. And he would sort of aim his hand inside of his jacket towards the person he was mugging. And he would say to them, as soon as he walked up to them, like, hey, I got a gun, give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you. And they would often look down, they'd see what they thought was a gun in his jacket, although they couldn't be sure. And, instead of questioning whether really Anthony had a gun or not, they would just hand over their money. Like, it wasn't worth it. Here, take my money. And Anthony would take their money and run off, right? So this worked most of the time. And he's thinking, Harry, here's my easy mark. This young, meek kid, I'm going to use the same thing on him. It's going to be so easy. And so he walks up to Harry and literally stands in front of him and blocks his way. And Harry actually kind of walks into him and is like, what's going on? And Anthony, he delivers the line. He's got his hand in the pocket, pretending he's got his gun. And he's like, hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot. But Harry, whether or not he believed that Anthony had a gun or not, he actually had virtually no way of confirming it one way or another because Harry was actually blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind because they were neighbors. And that was a big reason why he thought this was going to be so easy. I'm going to rob the slight blind kid. That's what I'm going to do. But what Anthony didn't realize is that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. And so when Harry was suddenly being told, you're going to get shot if you don't hand over your money, his instincts kicked in and he grabbed Anthony, flipped him over his shoulder and slammed him into the ground and broke his neck and killed him. And then he sat on top of his body until police arrived. Harry was never charged in connection with Anthony's death since it was determined he acted in self-defense. And even though the media called him a hero for defending himself, Harry actually felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He didn't mean to, he was just protecting himself. And so he called the whole thing a tragedy. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Both of today's stories are about people who made big choices that they thought would improve their lives. But neither of them really took the time to actually learn exactly what they were signing up for. And that led to disaster. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the follow button a brand new gumball machine. But don't tell them the gum is actually just painted balls of candle wax. Okay, let's get into our first story called Dream Car. At 8 a.m. on June 8, 2015, 72-year-old James Lee Rogers parked his beautiful red Corvette in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Port Arthur, Texas. And as he pulled that car into the lot, James, he just felt so proud to be driving this vehicle. This was a 2007 C6 Chevy Corvette, pristine condition, and it was exactly the car that James had been dreaming about like his whole life. It drove amazing, it looked incredible, and more than that, it had all these modern elements to it. It didn't even have regular door handles. Everything was like push buttons and electric. To him, owning this car was like owning a really flashy sports car, and he thought that, anybody who saw him driving it, they knew this guy had made it. And on top of having this really cool car, James also had like a pretty awesome life here in Port Arthur. He had lots of family in the area. He had grown up here. He loved living here. But he also really loved this particular Waffle House. It was where he went basically every morning in his flashy car to get his coffee. But, it wasn't just their coffee that he was drawn to. It was the wait staff. It was the regulars who went to this Waffle House. This had become like a sort of second home for him, and he really looked forward to coming here basically every day. And so he parks his Corvette, he gets out, and before he walks into the restaurant, he has to tell his dog, he brought his dog along, Leia, this cute little dog, to stay in the car because the dog was not allowed in the Waffle House. This was something he knew, but it was going to be quick. So he told Leia, to be a good girl and stay in the car. Don't rip it up. This is his dream car. She was a very good dog. And so she sat down. He shut the doors, used the electric push buttons to do it. And then once he knew his dog was secure, into the restaurant he went. Once he got inside, James took his usual seat at the counter where his friend MJ was already sitting. MJ was in his 60s, and like James, he was also a fixture at this Waffle House. And so the two immediately began chit-chatting about the weather and their kids. And then at some point, James ordered his coffee and used that as a chance to catch up with some of the waitstaff that he spoke to every morning. And then eventually more regulars began filtering in and out, and James made a point to chat with them and laugh with them as well. Again, this was like his second home. And in fact, on this particular day, there were so many people that he wanted to talk to coming in and out of the restaurant that he decided, my dog's fine out there. I've only been in here for a few minutes. I'm going to order some food as well. However, right after James ordered his food, he turned and he looked out the window into the parking lot. And even though he couldn't actually see his Corvette, he could see that it was extremely sunny and very hot outside. Like he knew that when he showed up, but he's looking out there and it just looks like a desert out there. It's so hot and there's nobody out there. It's just cars getting blasted by the sun. And he's thinking Leia's out there. And even though he had the AC on when he pulled up, and so, likely his Corvette was still a little bit cool, there was no way that it was particularly comfortable in his car right now. And so before his food showed up, James turned to MJ and just said, "Hey, I'm going to be right back. You want to just hold my seat? I'm going to go out and check on something." And MJ, who was kind of busy talking to other people, he's like, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll save your seat." And then James left the restaurant to go check on Leia. And so James, after leaving the Waffle House, he sort of ran around the corner out of view of where he had been sitting, and he went over to his beautiful dream car. And as soon as he walked up to the window, he could see that Leia was, very excited inside, happy to see James again. And, just for good measure, even though he now knew his dog's okay, he climbed inside the driver's seat and shut the door, and he turned around and he pet his dog, and he could tell the temperature inside the car was not that bad. And so he was only going to be in the restaurant for another 15, 20 minutes tops. She'd be okay. However, after only having sat inside his car for a matter of maybe 30 or 60 seconds, he felt himself getting really hot. It was definitely not cool inside the car, and the sun's burning through the windows, and he just was like, "You know what? This is not responsible to leave my dog in here. I can't do this." And so even though he had placed his order for food, he figured he could go in there, cancel the order. He was a regular. They'd understand. He could have one more sip of coffee, but that was it. He needed to get back out here and basically put the AC back on and get him and his dog back into the comforts of their own home. But when James pushed that super fancy button on his car door that he was sort of so proud of how modern his vehicle was, when he pushed it to open his door, nothing happened. And so James, he's just staring at the door in confusion because this has never happened before. And so he starts pushing it a few more times, but again, nothing happened. And then after a few moments, when this car door was not budging, James reached across and started pushing the button on the passenger side door to see if maybe it was just an issue with, his door. But no, that door wouldn't open either. And so finally, he decided he would just try to turn the car on to see if maybe that would help. But he couldn't get his car to turn on. The Corvette was completely dead, and James had no idea why. But he knew this was not good because, this car, because it's so modern, didn't have normal handles. They really were all electric, all buttons. And so if these buttons aren't working and all the windows are up, what do you do? How do you get out? And so James, he's starting to stress out about what's going to happen here? Is he going to have to break a window of his beloved vehicle here? Is that what he's going to have to do? And also, how crazy is that? How could he have wound up in this position? But also, the sun is just burning through the glass, and he's suddenly becoming really aware of just how hot it was getting inside of his car. This is sort of becoming an emergency really quickly. Because again, he can't even turn on the car, so he can't turn on the AC. He's inside of an oven at this point. And so James instinctively reached for where his phone would normally be, but it wasn't there. And that's when he remembered he had left his phone inside the Waffle House. When he had gone in earlier, it was low on charge and he had handed it off to one of the waitstaff to go plug in somewhere. And so his phone's inside. He has no way to contact anyone. But luckily, right at that point, James looked out the corner of his eye and he saw a couple walking out of the Waffle House. And he's like, oh, thank goodness, someone's coming out. I can get their attention. They can come over here and get me out of here, or at least, call someone who can. And so he starts waving, through the front windshield at this couple as they're sort of walking generally in his direction, but they clearly didn't see him. Like the sun is glaring off the glass, kind of making it hard to see inside. And so James is sort of realizing this, and he's becoming more and more desperate as he and his dog are getting more and more overheated. And so he began leaning on the horn to get their attention that way, but no sound came out of his Corvette because the horn was powered by electricity, and again, the car is dead. And so James now is getting frantic. He's banging on the windows. He's screaming to them. But this is a nice car. It's totally soundproof inside. Again, there's the glare from the sun on the glass. The windows are partially tinted. They can't see or hear him. And so this couple eventually comes right near his vehicle. They climb in their car and they drive away without ever noticing him. Once they were gone, James told himself that, you know what, this is a busy area. Lots of people come in and out of this Waffle House. Someone's going to see us. Someone's going to get us out of this car. And so for the next several minutes, James looked all around him, looking for anybody walking through this parking lot, looking for people coming out of the Waffle House, and anybody who came even close to his vehicle, he would scream and yell and bang and do anything he could to get their attention. But nobody noticed him. Like no one could see or hear him. And now James and his dog were really starting to struggle with the heat inside of this vehicle. It really was like they were trapped inside of an oven. And so eventually, when it seemed like no one was going to notice them, James just began frantically looking around the interior of his car for a toolkit. He thought he had left a toolkit in here somewhere, in case of emergencies. And he's thinking, maybe there was a tool in there he could use to maybe jimmy open one of the doors, or if he had to, he could maybe use something heavy in the toolkit to break a window, just to get out that way. And so eventually, in the back seat near Leia, he found this toolkit, but when he cracked it open, he was disappointed because it really didn't have anything that useful. There were some pliers, there were some jumper cables, and a flashlight. But, James, he still took the pliers and he jammed the head of the pliers into the crack of the driver's side door to attempt to basically wrench open the door. But the pliers were very thin, and so he didn't budge the door at all. And he used a lot of energy trying to, force the door open. And remember, it's like blisteringly hot inside of the vehicle at this point, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Like Leah's struggling to breathe. James is, drenched in sweat, and so he drops the pliers, and he just has this huge wave of anxiety come over him that like, oh my goodness, like, is this it? Are we going to die in here? And so as like this crushing reality is coming down on him, James has this adrenaline surge, and he leans back in his seat and he starts kicking as hard as he can against the glass with his feet to try to break open the windshield or kick open the driver's side window. But amazingly, despite all of his energy going into this, he didn't crack the window at all. Like it felt like he was kicking a concrete wall. There was no budge, nothing. And so again, after exerting even more energy and now sweating even more, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe, James took those pliers and he's really gassed. He can barely breathe, and he starts smashing the head of the pliers into the window. That didn't do anything. So it's like, I can't do anything to get out of this vehicle. And so James, he sort of just like lays back in the driver's seat, which he had reclined at this point, and he's panting. He can barely breathe. He's opened up his shirt a little bit, and he's looking back at his dog, and she's really struggling, and he's just like, I can't believe this is happening. And as he's laying there, he sort of looks towards the front of the car, and his eyes land on the glove box in front of the passenger seat. And it was like, oh my goodness, how could I forget? There's a manual inside of there. There has got to be instructions for what to do if your car dies. There's got to be a way to get out. Like, it's got to be in that manual. And so suddenly, having all this energy, James sat up, he opened up the glove box, and he pulled out this manual that he had never read before. I mean, he had no reason to, but he opened it up and he began looking through it, looking for, the section that would explain what to do in case of, total power outage and you're stuck inside the vehicle. But like as he's looking at the pages, like his vision's swimming, it's so hot. he's so tired and it's all this little text. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And like nothing explained the situation. It was like so not user-friendly. And so James, he's flipping through all these pages, and even just the act of turning the page was becoming so laborious. Like he is just beginning to shut down. I mean, he's basically dying inside of an oven, and he can barely turn the page. And then before long, after about a quarter of the way through, it was like he couldn't see anymore, and he literally just like he couldn't turn the page anymore. He had no strength left. MJ, so James's buddy, the guy in his 60s who was also a regular at the Waffle House, he's inside the Waffle House. He's having his breakfast and his coffee. He knew James had stepped out. He was going to be right back, and he did not come right back. But he figured no big deal. Like, he probably got caught up with something. Maybe he forgot that he had ordered food. But, MJ, he's got all these reasons for why James has not come back to the restaurant. And also, MJ, being a regular, he's chatting it up with other people. He's not really even aware of the fact that James has not come back inside the Waffle House. And eventually, after MJ had had his coffee and his food, he's getting ready to maybe make an exit himself when two employees come running in the front door of the Waffle House. And so everybody turns to these employees who clearly are sort of making a scene here, and they're like, what's going on? And the employees, they're like, we just saw James. He's asleep in his car, and we can't open the doors. We slammed on the windows, but he's not reacting. At this point, MJ felt sick to his stomach because he suddenly realized when he looked at his watch, it had been 4 hours since James had gone outside saying he'd be right back. Now, MJ, he got caught up doing other things, and he was in here all the time. He loved being here. Time flew when he was in here, but even he didn't understand how much time had passed. And he's thinking oh my gosh, what's happened to James? And so MJ jumps out of his seat and he runs outside into the blistering heat. He goes around the corner to the red Corvette. He sees, through the tinted glass, there's James inside of the vehicle. He starts hitting on the window, but there's no answer. James isn't moving. And so MJ calls 911. It would turn out when James bought the red Corvette, it really was like his dream car. He fell in love with it. It was beautiful. It was flashy. It oozed status. It had all this new tech. It looked so expensive. It was perfect. And James, he didn't just, buy this car and that was it. After he had it, he obsessed over it. He learned every little detail about it. He took great care of it. He drove it everywhere. This was like his child. But despite, really obsessing over the car, he never learned one really important thing about this car, which is what do you do if you happen to be inside of the vehicle with the windows rolled up and your power goes out? Because the doors are not regular doors. They're powered by buttons. They're electrical. And if you have no power, you can't open them, as he found. Well, it turns out there's actually a lever under the driver's seat that once you pull it up, it pops open the driver's side door and you can get out, no matter if there's electricity or not. But that information was buried on page 80 of that owner's manual that he had pulled out and begun flipping through, but he was so delirious from heat exhaustion, he couldn't get that far into the manual. He's combing through all this really dense text. He made it about a quarter of the way through when unfortunately he and his dog Leia died from heat exhaustion. James's family filed a wrongful death case with Chevrolet, the maker of the Corvette, in 2018, but the case was dismissed. Chevrolet still makes Corvettes with these special electric doors, and there have been numerous additional incidents of people getting locked in and trapped. But in more recent Corvette models, the manuals have the information about the door's release lever much closer to the front of the manual. Our second and final story today is called A Call to Arms. On the morning of August 20th, 1862, a 17-year-old farmhand named Jean Leroux carried his axe over to a stack of logs by a barn on a farm in Ottawa Township, Minnesota. As a farmhand, Jean was responsible for lots of different odd jobs, like splitting the firewood and feeding the animals and helping with the crops. Basically, Jean had to know every single inch of the farm and the woods that surrounded it, and how to take care of it all. But even though he was basically constantly busy, Jean still found his mind wandering to a place that was sort of difficult, which was he felt a lot of times pretty homesick. So Jean was actually from France, and he had left behind his whole family and his, previous life to come here to America, where there was supposed to be more opportunity. However, America was turning out to be a pretty violent place. The country was currently fighting the Civil War. And on top of that, the area specifically where Jean lived was pretty much like the frontier. And so there were these constant territorial disputes and virtually no law enforcement. So just a really dangerous place. But more than any dangers he faced, Jean just really missed his family, especially his mom. So he spent basically every spare minute he had, which was, few and far between, sitting out in the woods by this one particular just huge, beautiful oak tree. And he would sit at the base of it and he would make journal entries about basically everything he was doing so he could track it all and know what to tell his mom when he finally got to see her again. He just wanted to tell her all about his experience. Also, just for context, Jean had saved virtually all the money he had worked so hard to acquire. And his whole plan was to eventually send that money to his mother, who he loved so very much and missed so much. But more and more, like the more homesick he became, the more he wished he could actually just go back to France and get out of America and literally hand the money to his mom and just see her again and be done with this whole America experiment. But for now, Jean raised his axe over his head and he brought it down on the log that he was going to split. And it did, it split open, and he raised the axe again to chop another log, but as he did, he froze, because off in the distance, he could hear a series of repetitive booming noises, like really loud. And for Jean, immediately his heart started to race and he was so scared because he knew what those were. Those were gunshots. And he was terrified that the thing that he, and really everybody else in his town, had been scared of for days was now finally happening. So right on the other side of the woods that surrounded the farm was the Minnesota River. And over the last decade, lots of people had settled along this river. And there'd been a town established right nearby, and new homes were being built constantly. However, all the expansion had literally forced out the indigenous tribe who had previously lived in the area, the Sioux. And after being displaced, these Sioux had struggled to find food and a place to live, while the settlers just continued to expand and take more of their land. So finally, just 2 days earlier, the Sioux had had enough, and they finally retaliated, attacking settlements along that river. It was being called the Sioux Uprising, and the attacks so far had been horrific. A lot of farms along that river had been burned to the ground, and their occupants had been killed right alongside it. And then just yesterday, the Sioux had attacked a city that was just 50 miles down the river from where Jean was right now. And so Jean and everybody else in this particular area had really been terrified the last 24 hours that the violence was moving in their direction towards Ottawa Township. And so now Jean, he had put his axe down and he just stood there, trembling as the sound of gunshots continued. This was not just a few stray bullets. This was a barrage of gunfire. And so this could only mean one thing. The Sioux were here. Now, Jean couldn't tell exactly where the shooting was coming from, but he could tell it was pretty close. And so Jean knew that he likely only had maybe several minutes to gather up whatever he could of his possessions and get to safety before the Sioux arrived. So Jean, he bolts over to the farmhouse, goes inside, and he goes to the area inside where he slept, and he grabbed his rifle, and he also grabbed his notebook and all that cash he'd been saving for his mom. And he jammed the notebook and the cash into a satchel, and with his rifle over his shoulder, he ran back outside. And then once he was outside, he sprinted right towards the tree line at the edge of the property. And after running for a little while, Jean finally stopped to catch his breath and to listen to see if there was more gunfire. And as he sat there listening, he couldn't hear anything. But that's when he realized, he's all alone out here. If the Sioux came charging through the trees right now, he wouldn't stand a chance even with his rifle. But Jean had an advantage. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He was in here all the time. And because of that, he knew exactly where to go to find safety. About an hour later, Jean's boss and the owner of the farm, Edward Gleek, hustled from his farmhouse towards town. Mr. Gleek had also heard the gunshots. Basically everybody in town had. And he had come running out of the barn just in time to see his farmhand Jean LaRue, bolting off into the woods. And, Mr. Gleek, he didn't blame the kid. He was also horrified by the recent attacks and was also very worried that those shots they were hearing were a sign that trouble had finally arrived in their town. But after all these gunshots, no Sioux warriors showed up in town. And so now Mr. Gleek was heading to the town center to see what had actually happened. Like, what were those gunshots? Now, Mr. Gleek had sort of accepted that this could have been something totally benign, or it could have been the Sioux. He didn't know. But he was just going to find out. He was rational. He was calm, despite, the risks here. But when he got into the town center, all he could see was just chaos. Many of the area's residents were out running around, carrying trunks and bags and all their belongings like they were fleeing the area, much like Mr. Gleek's farmhand, Jean LaRue, had looked like he was doing. However, it didn't take long for Mr. Gleek to hear what had happened, and it was not an attack by the Sioux. Those people running around like maniacs, fleeing the area, they just hadn't heard the real story yet. They were sort of operating like there was an attack coming. So apparently, a group of American soldiers had been riding on a boat up the Minnesota River, and for some reason, they just gotten overly excited and began firing their guns repeatedly. So those were gunshots. And unfortunately, because they were gunshots, they completely freaked out all the residents around the river because of this growing threat of the Sioux attacking. But fortunately, at least in this case, there were no attacks. This was just, an unfortunate event. And so after hearing this, Mr. Gleek went back to his farm to find Jean and tell him that, everything was actually just fine. But when he got there, Jean still had not come back yet. And when Mr. Gleek went into the woods to go look around for him, he couldn't find him. Now, Mr. Gleek figured that Jean would eventually find out what happened, much like everybody else in town. Not everyone had the news yet, and so at some point that day, he was bound to return. But by the time night fell, Jean still had not come back. And then the next day, Jean didn't come back. And the next day, and the next day, he just didn't come back. And so finally, after repeatedly searching his property and asking all over town if anybody had seen Jean, Mr. Gleek finally came to the conclusion that Jean must have fled because of this Sioux attack, and then likely gone back to France to be with his mother, something he knew he wanted to do anyways. Maybe this was his excuse. 57 years later, on a morning in July of 1919, Mr. Gleek sat on his porch looking out over his farm, the same farm that Jean had been a farmhand for 57 years earlier. Mr. Gleek was old now, and so he could no longer actually physically work on the farm himself. So instead, he had to hire entire crews to do various jobs. And in fact, right now, he had a whole bunch of workers out in the woods clearing away some dead brush for him. And so as Mr. Gleek is just kind of surveying his property, he notices a worker come running out of the tree line and starts waving at Mr. Gleek really frantically, like he had something really important to say. And then as the man got closer, Mr. Gleek could see that this worker looked terrified. And before Mr. Gleek could ask what had happened, the worker, whose face was, white as a ghost, said Mr. Gleek needed to come and see something. And so Mr. Gleek, who was, very intrigued at this point, managed to haul himself up, and he slowly hobbled off into the woods with this worker. And as he got to where the rest of the crew was, inside the forest, he saw that they were all mostly gathered around this very large, recently downed oak tree. And the whole group was very quiet and tense, and they were all just staring at a section of this tree that had split open. When Mr. Gleek joined the group and looked at this particular section of the trunk of this tree, this hollow part, at first he didn't even know what he was staring at. It was just this hollowed out sort of split section of the tree, and there was a few items that didn't belong there that were inside of it, like a cache of sorts. But then he sort of fixated on one particular item, and that's when he understood why the group was just so stunned. And as he stared and sort of took in what he was seeing, he suddenly became utterly horrified. It would turn out, when Jean ran off into the woods 57 years earlier, he used his intimate knowledge of the farmland and the surrounding woods to escape what he thought was a very dangerous situation. And he did that by hiding. Jean knew that oak tree where he would always go when he would write in his notebook happened to have a hollow trunk. And he figured he'd be just the right size to crawl inside of there and stay in there hidden until the Sioux were gone. And so Jean had made it to the tree, and he had wedged himself inside of there, totally out of view. And then unfortunately, he got stuck. From inside the trunk of the tree, Jean had managed to write one last letter to Mr. Gleek, saying that he couldn't get out, he was stuck. And if he did die here, to please give all his money to his mother in France. And so decades later, when Mr. Gleek's workers cut that big oak tree down, what they found inside of the hollow trunk was Jean's gun, his money, his notebook, and his mummified body. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Today, we have two stories about people who finally got to attend an event that they'd been working toward for years, but in both cases, actually going to these events would turn out to be the biggest mistakes of their lives. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to shovel the snow off the Follow Button's driveway. But be sure to shovel the snow directly into their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Evidence. On the morning of November 18th, 2019, 54-year-old detective Muzi Mkhize stood in a long line waiting to get into a courthouse in Ikapa, South Africa. So Muzi was an investigator on a very violent robbery case that was finally being tried today, even though the robbery itself had happened almost 6 years earlier. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse in Ikapa and brutally beat the couple before making off with a bunch of electronics and jewelry and weapons and other valuables. And so Muzi and his team had eventually caught and arrested these criminals, and in fact, they were even able to recover some of the items that had been stolen. In fact, now, Muzi had one of those stolen items with him to present as evidence at today's trial. Muzi had done this kind of court duty plenty of times in his career, but today, he felt really drained. On top of his trial prep for, this case, he'd also been working other active cases and also mentoring junior detectives. And Muzi was not young and energetic anymore. He was nearing retirement age, and all these obligations were really starting to take a toll on him. But the biggest thing that was really exhausting Muzi was this robbery case itself. It had been an extremely long process, full of an unusual number of delays and complications. It had actually taken so long to bring this to trial that the evidence Muzi was holding, like literally right now, had actually been returned to the victim couple so they could use it until the trial finally happened. So getting this case to this point had been extremely tiring, but Muzi and his team were determined to see it through no matter what, because the criminals that did this, they were incredibly violent and genuinely needed to be behind bars to protect the public. They'd severely beaten this couple to the point where they were hospitalized, and it was lucky they hadn't been killed. As Muzi entered the courthouse and passed through the court security checkpoint, he hoped the security guards were appropriately on alert. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones who were on trial today, often had violent friends, especially in Ikapa, where this kind of crime was unfortunately rampant. It wasn't unheard of for criminals or gang members to barge into court proceedings and retaliate against cops or prosecution. But Muzi was able to get through security. There was no suspicious people or any sort of disruptions of any kind. And so Muzi, once through, made his way into the courtroom. And he saw the space was already full. The defense and the jury and prosecutors and judge were all there, and there were members of the public in the gallery. Muzi went over and sat down at the prosecution table, and he would remain there until it was his turn to go up to the judge and present, which would include, showing this evidence. As Muzi got settled into his seat and, put the evidence down in his lap, he turned and sort of gave a quick wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting at the table as well. She was going over her trial notes. Muzi had worked with Adelaide before, and they got along really well together. And she was a total pro, at least in Muzi's mind. So he knew that, her being on board meant this case had a really good chance of getting a conviction. Adelaide waved back at Muzi and then quickly got back to her notes. And Muzi took a look around the courtroom and everything seemed quiet and, again, there was no sign of any gang members or criminal friends charging in to cause problems. And, Muzi just hoped it would stay this way and that the trial would go smoothly and end the way he hoped it would. A few minutes later, and the judge sort of called the court to order and got the trial started, at which point Adelaide got up and began to present the case. And at this moment, despite the fact that Muzi had waited almost 6 years to get to this point, at this moment when it finally was happening, he just felt this enormous wave of exhaustion sweep over him. He wasn't energized, it was sort of the opposite. It was like relief. And also, the room they were in was pretty hot and, he was pretty tired, and before long, his eyelids got heavier and heavier, and eventually his head kind of slumped over to the side, and he dozed off. And at first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, Muzi just slept in the courtroom, and nobody even noticed or cared. Everything was okay. But then at some point, there was this sudden, very loud scraping sound. It was the sound of a bunch of chairs in the courtroom moving across the ground, and it was just very loud, and it woke Muzi up, but like really abruptly. He was startled by the sound, and when he woke up, like in his, sudden jolting awake, he dropped the evidence that he was supposed to be in charge of onto the ground. And so he's getting up, he's getting his bearings, realizing that it's kind of embarrassing. He was asleep. Did anybody see him? Like, what's going on? Everyone's moving around. He sees the evidence on the ground, so he goes under the table, he scoops the evidence back up, and as he's sitting back up, he hears this loud, like deafening bang echo through the courtroom, and he still really doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he just woke up, it's sort of chaotic in the room, and then he hears this scream coming from the side, sort of over to his right, and he turns and he realizes the scream came from the prosecutor, Adelaide. And so Muzi looks over the table, and he sees Adelaide laying on the ground, and she's clutching her hip, and her hip is now gushing blood. And so obviously she's been attacked. That loud banging sound he heard was almost certainly a gunshot or an explosion of some kind. And so Muzi immediately is thinking, clearly the friends or affiliates of these criminals on trial have stormed the courthouse and they've attacked us. They've attacked Adelaide. Are there more shooters here? Are there more attackers in the building? And so Muzi, who again, he's only woken up like 30 seconds ago, he's still sort of confused. He begins looking around the courthouse for, perpetrators, someone who's attacking, a gunman or something. But all he sees is just the chaos of people trying to flee the courthouse and others rushing up to Adelaide to try to render care. Like, there were no perpetrators, there were no gunmen, there was nothing, it was just chaos. And so for a second, Muzi is just sitting there, not really even sure what to do, almost like paralyzed by shock, and also, again, he's just woken up, he's sort of getting his bearings. And then he thinks of something, he's looking around the courthouse, this crazy scene, and he realizes that there is no gunman, there's no perpetrator, there's nobody, there's nothing, which can only mean one thing. So to understand what happened inside of that courtroom, you first have to understand something about South African police procedure. And that is that in South Africa, as in most countries, after evidence is taken from the scene of a crime, it's examined and determined to be safe and then transferred to an exhibit room until it's time for trial. However, unlike in other parts of the world, in South Africa, there are exceptions to this procedure. And this trial had taken almost 6 years to start. And because of that huge time lag, some of the evidence that was recovered from the robbers' homes had actually been returned to the victim couple it was taken from, so they could just use it until the trial finally happened. The couple had returned that particular evidence to the police that morning, and Muzi had been charged with bringing that evidence to court and literally holding that evidence. But Muzi, when he did this, didn't double check to make sure this evidence was safe to be in a courtroom. And sometime after Muzi fell asleep in the courtroom, the judge had announced that it was time to take a break. And so the scraping of chairs that woke him up was the sound of people getting up to leave. But for Muzi, it startled him and he sat up really suddenly, what's going on? And he dropped this evidence onto the ground. And it would turn out this was like the worst thing that could have possibly happened, because this particular evidence was a shotgun. And when Muzi, sort of in his panicked, instinctive state, when he first woke up and he saw the evidence on the ground, he reached down to grab it, to pick it back up, because he was supposed to hold this thing for the whole trial and present it. The last thing he needed is people to see that he had fallen asleep and dropped it on the ground. But when he scooped it up, the gun, again, because it had not been re-examined, it would turn out it was still loaded. And so as he scooped it up, he accidentally hit the trigger and fired it, and it hit Adelaide, severed an artery, and killed her. But Muzi, was so confused by the chaos of the scene that at first, he didn't even realize he had fired the gun. He just scooped up the gun, heard the bang, and he's like, what's going on here? And it was when he realized there was no gunman that he looked down, and he realized the shotgun was aimed right at Adelaide. He must have shot her. Muzi ultimately pled guilty to culpable homicide and negligence, and he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, it was suspended. Our second and final story is called Legacy. On the morning of July 14th, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden, getting dressed and ready for the day. And he was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympics. So a marathon is a race that covers exactly 26.2 miles. And for elite runners, it usually takes them between 2 and 3 hours to finish. Lazaro was representing Portugal, and this was actually a really big deal. This was his home country's very first Olympics, which meant Lazaro was one of only a few Portuguese athletes at the Games. And Lazaro believed that out of all of those people, all those other Portuguese athletes, he actually stood the best chance at bringing home an actual medal. So Lazaro had a chance to do something really historic for his country. And realistically, he wasn't even that nervous, because he knew he was a truly elite, incredible runner. Even though he was just 21 years old, Lazaro had already won 3 huge marathons in Portugal. So he was already a star back home. But he knew that if he wanted to win on the world stage, he would need to come extremely prepared. So that's exactly what he'd done. He'd trained for months, obviously. He'd also recently gotten a medical exam to confirm that he was very healthy. And he'd even begun thinking about, little ways that he could potentially give himself a boost, like how to fuel, what to put in his body and even what to put on his body. I mean, even the smallest detail, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that kind of sat heavily in his stomach, could make the difference between winning or losing. Because again, this is like the world's best runners. Any little edge, he was going to take it. So now, Lazaro spent the next hour putting on the very specific clothes that he'd selected for this race, and also eating a perfectly balanced light meal containing carbohydrates and protein, basically exactly what he had mapped out to help him in this race. He'd been warned that it was supposed to be very, very hot today on race day. But Lazaro actually saw this as an advantage, because being from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than places like Sweden, Lazaro already knew how to protect himself from the sun and the heat, and how to give himself an edge in this weather. And then before he knew it, Lazaro was ready to go, and he had left his hotel room, and he was on his way to the stadium to actually compete in the Olympics. A few hours later, around 1:45 p.m., Lazaro walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive stadium where the race was going to start. And as race officials directed him and his 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Lazaro was feeling really confident. In fact, so confident that he called out to a nearby reporter that he was going to be the winner, saying, quote, "I win or I die." Now, as Lazaro and the others actually took their spots on the starting line, they were in the direct sunlight, and it was just unbelievably hot. I mean, in the shade, it was already 90 degrees, so it was like a sweltering day. But as Lazaro looked up and down the line of the other competitors, he saw everybody else look flushed and they were sweating profusely. They looked not ready to go run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed. But Lazaro, he was not overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, Lazaro wasn't even sweating. As Lazaro stood there waiting for this race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people in the stands. And for a moment, he just stood there taking it all in and just appreciating how special this moment really was. The marathon was a major event in these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out, and even the king and queen of Stockholm were supposed to be somewhere in the crowd watching this. And as Lazaro stood there having this moment, sort of taking it all in, he also had this certainty that when this race was finished, all those people in the stadium and around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer tell the runners to take their marks. Lazaro felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. A big hush fell over the crowd, and Lazaro and the rest of the racers stopped moving and just tensed, waiting for the signal. A couple of seconds went by, and then, bang, the starting gun went off, and Lazaro and everybody else lunged forward. And there was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line, and Lazaro was pushed back towards the middle of the pack. And right off the bat, Lazaro was a little surprised by how quick the overall pace was. But Lazaro still wasn't worried. He'd studied this course extensively, and he knew that he'd have a chance to get out in front of his competitors pretty soon. This marathon route was very flat, but Lazaro was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners invariably started to get tired, especially from this hot weather, he'd still be feeling fine and he could move out in front. So Lazaro just decided to hang back and wait to make his move as they moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt road beyond. And for the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan and just kept his pace steady in the back. He knew, at some point, people would begin falling off as the heat wore down on them and they got tired, and he'd be able to make his way up, so he wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was sort of keeping his pace in the back, he even was able to give another soundbite to one of the reporters that was on the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Lazaro really felt like he was running the race of his life. It was like everything in his training and in his background had prepared him to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently moving past runners, some of whom were really struggling in the heat because they clearly weren't used to it. Some had actually stopped running altogether and just put their hands on their knees, while others just sat on the ground, unable to get up. So basically everything was playing out exactly the way Lazaro expected it to. He was, making his move slowly but surely towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for Lazaro, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. He just felt really off. His legs got a really heavy, just like lead feeling, and a few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry. Lazaro kept on running and, told himself he was fine, and that this was just, late race fatigue kicking in. And for what it's worth, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that at about the 19 to 20 mile mark, that's sort of the real halfway of the race, not the 13-mile mark. The 20-mile mark is where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. And so he's basically saying that, that's normal. This happens when you hit about 20 miles. And so as Lazaro worked as hard as he could to put one foot in front of the other and just to keep on going, he began telling himself that, this was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name, and he was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to just completely giving out. And he slammed to the ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled in a man on a stretcher. They explained that this man was named Francisco Lazaro, and he'd collapsed in the middle of the marathon. And the doctor was really not surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who'd gotten sick from this really oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began specifically examining Lazaro, he knew that this case was different and was much, much more serious. His other patients that day had all relatively mild symptoms like sweating and general fatigue and dizziness, which had easily been cured by providing water and cooling them off. But Lazaro, he was twitching and convulsing, and he was shouting deliriously that he'd won the race. So the doctor rushed him into an exam room and took his temperature. And when he saw it was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, he knew this situation was critical. A temperature that high was often fatal, and Lazaro's organs were likely already shutting down. And so the doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in some water and some ice, but Lazaro, he did not respond to the hospital's treatments. And as the hours passed by, Lazaro actually got worse. The doctor and his team, they worked through the night treating Lazaro and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Lazaro died. After Lazaro's death, that doctor just could not shake the idea that something just felt off about Lazaro's death. Heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Lazaro had seemed to have a very bad case of heat stroke, but lots of runners had gotten heat stroke during this marathon, and all of them had wound up being fine. So the doctor ultimately decided to run some tests on Lazaro to see if maybe there was something else that had been going on, like maybe there was some underlying illness or other factor that was to blame for his death. And when the doctor finally did get those tests back, the results made Lazaro famous. So remember, Lazaro had put a lot of thought into how to prepare for this big race. He trained extremely hard, he ate right, he chose the right clothes, the right shoes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken in advance of this race had paid off. Especially when Lazaro looked down the line at the start and he saw all the other runners were like pouring sweat and flush and just looking horrible. It just seemed like everybody was already exhausted before they had even started. But not Lazaro. He wasn't even sweating because of one of the precautions he had taken. But not sweating in this type of heat was actually a very bad thing. Sweat is the body's way of cooling itself down. So Lazaro's lack of sweat was actually a sign that he was in danger. And it was all thanks to Lazaro's extra strong sunscreen. Because it would turn out Lazaro was so prepared that he went out and found what he thought would be the best and most powerful sunscreen option ever. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of animal fat that's typically used in cooking or making candles and soap. It's also sometimes used for skincare, since it has a lot of nutrients and is generally good for the skin. And Lazaro believed that because suet is very thick, it would act as a barrier against the intensity of the sun. So he slathered a bunch of suet all over his body just before the big race. What he didn't anticipate was that this suet that was now all over him would work too well. It was so thick that it clogged the pores in his skin and prevented anything from passing through, even sweat. And without a way to cool itself down, Lazaro's body essentially turned into a furnace, which cooked him from the inside out. The weekend after Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him, and over 20,000 people attended to pay tribute to him. And it's probably not quite the type of fame he had hoped for, but Lazaro's name is still frequently referenced today in Portugal. The Portuguese refer to someone who looks sick and bedraggled as looking like Lazaro. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.